Welcome to the Healthier Tech Podcast, the show about building a healthier relationship with technology. Now here's your host, R. Blank.
Enough is enough, say over 100 health advocacy groups who are uniting to restore local government rights over the placement of cell towers and antennas. Back in 1996, an act of Congress took those rights away, stripping local governments of their ability to influence where this wireless infrastructure goes. Today, a new coalition called 704 No More is working to reverse that. This movement is about restoring the power of state and local governments to protect their communities from the mounting health and environmental risks linked to radiation emitted by these towers and antennae. This topic is deeply personal for me. My father, Dr. Martin Blank, was a leading scientist at Columbia University who spent decades researching the biological effects of electromagnetic fields. Today, I'm joined by longtime health and environmental advocate Camilla Rees and attorney Scott McCollough, Esquire, outside counsel to 704 No More, and an expert in telecom law. We'll dive into how this coalition began, why it matters, and what's at stake if we don't reclaim local control over this biologically disruptive infrastructure. Camilla, Scott, welcome to the Healthier Tech Podcast.
Thank you very much, R. Great to be here. We miss
Really
your
great
father.
to be here.
Yeah, thank you both, and thank you, Camilla. So, first off, what is as we get into the topic, what is the 704 in 704 No More stand for?
The Telecom Act of 1996 had a section called Section 704, and that was where they took away the state and local government's rights to influence the siting of cell towers and antennas on health or environmental grounds. So after that, it became very, very difficult for local communities to find grounds on which they were able to influence the siting of antennas and towers. And it also led to some courts determining that people who've been injured were not entitled to any legal recourse, any compensation for injuries related to health or environment or, aesthetic blight, relocation costs, temporary housing, real estate devaluation. There's no recourse. So 704 No More is an initiative that is going to be addressing both of those issues. And Scott can tell you more on the legal front.
Yeah, and Scott, also, what was the ostensible legal justification or purpose of this clause? Like, I understand why they did it. I'm looking for why they said they did it.
Well, let's just go ahead and be open and honest about why they did it. Congress did this because the industry wrote a lot of fat contribution checks, and the legislators did their billing. I was doing telecommunications law during the time, 1996. I wasn't involved in the wireless health and environmental issue, but I was representing small upstart competitors, dial-up independent internet service providers, people who did payphones, people who did long distance service, people who wanted to provide like local service. And other sections of the 96 Act also did a lot of things in that area. So I was around when this thing was passed. And it was really evident that all of this, it had a lot of fancy names. We're going to bring competition. We're going to deregulate. We're going to improve consumers' well-being. But it was really, to be candid, in most of the other respects, a payment to the industry and a way to get around some of the antitrust decrees that had been enforced against AT&T and then the then GTE system. They'd been found to violate the antitrust acts, and they were under divestiture and other competition decrees. The statute writ large basically undid those antitrust decrees, sent everything to the FCC to be adjudicated. Now, how do we fit into this? Well, again, I'm going to I don't want to take too long, but to go through the history, when this bill was before Congress in late 95, the House had some provisions dealing with this very topic. It was much, much different. What it basically had said was that for local permitting, there was supposed to be a nationwide collaborative effort to come up with protocols, procedures, and indeed standard terms and conditions for siting that would be overseen by local jurisdictions. It was supposed to be something that was collaborative and overseen by the FCC and ultimately approved by it. But when the Senate had its piece of this, it didn't have any provisions on this. They passed two different bills, very much different. It went to what we call a conference committee. And then when it popped out of conference committee, there was a whole bunch of stuff in there that was brand new. And this was one of the things that was brand new, came out at the last minute. Instead of having a collaborative effort, keeping the local jurisdictions involved, including more ability to deal with environmental effects, which was what the House had done. Instead, they basically took away the ability of local jurisdictions to protect the environment and their local constituents insofar as it had anything to do with health or environmental effects. Just took it away from them. Said, you can't do with this.
Yeah, it sounds un-American.
A separate section of the Act, what we call 704B, 704, the one that stripped local jurisdictions' powers, is 704A of the 96 Act. 704B was an instruction to the FCC to finish its NEPA proceeding, its National Environmental Protection Act proceeding, on exposure guidelines within 180 days. And they did that. And we've been litigating the question ever since. Ever since 1997, people have been fighting with the FCC over its preemptive exposure guideline. And I can talk about that litigation too. It's related but separate from the 704 Act. We won a case 4 years ago with the D.C. Circuit telling the FCC that it had to revisit its exposure guidelines and take into account some of the updates to the technology and the ubiquity of wireless now, all these many, many different exposure sources that the rules don't really take into account, and the newer technology, the new kinds of modulation and pulsation, and indeed the environmental effects. But the FCC has refused so far, even after 4 years now. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the decision. Refused to do that.
So Camilla, yeah, go on.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for the length of this answer, but everybody's got to understand the context. The FCC's been in charge of this. Court found it was all arbitrary and capricious. They're refusing to change anything. What the 704 No More effort really is about is, well, FCC, you can have your rules, but they can't strip people of their individual rights. FCC, you can regulate licensees. You can tell a licensee how to operate. But FCC, you do not regulate individual people. You don't have control over individual people's bodies. You cannot force them to accept exposure. And similarly, FCC, you do not regulate local jurisdictions. They are not regulated parties. They're not licensees. And therefore, you cannot strip, even through a statute, local jurisdictions, historical, state, police powers to protect their citizens from health and environmental effects. That's the underpinning theory.
And that I'd like to get back to that to explore that a little more. But Camilla, Scott pointed out how much the infrastructure has changed in the last 29 years? Wow. In the last, I remember watching Seinfeld back then, like it was yesterday. In the last 29 years, what have we learned on the science side in that same period?
Well, actually, when it comes to science, we need to go back even further because there have been many U.S. government studies done, review studies that have shown, going back to over half a century ago, that have shown the biological and health effects. And science continues to come out. Dr. Joel Moskowitz at UC Berkeley keeps a log of the important science as it continues to come out. Today's chronic illness problem, as Richard Lear and I pointed out in a paper, is 23 of the fastest growing chronic illnesses in America today were predicted by a U.S. Navy study back in 1971. And since that time, there have been other studies by NASA, EPA, Defense Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Interior has said the exposure guidelines are not adequate to protect wildlife. So my point is that we've known for decades about the serious consequences from this radiation, and the regulators failed us. So while science continues to come out and people within industry often will call for more science and more research is needed. The reality is there's plenty of research already that shows that this energy force is biologically disruptive to our DNA, to other molecules, to the cellular level. Like your father did a lot of research on the cellular stress response. It's damaging to tissues like the blood-brain barrier and the gut barrier. The emergence of the whole functional medicine field over the past 15 years or so which is great because it's focusing on the systems. We're systems. We're a nonstop active living being that this energy is affecting on the systems level as well as the cellular level and the DNA level. And so it's across the board. And the NTP study, which was done by the NIH a couple years back, it was an animal study. And in the published report, it didn't mention this, but on the online posting of the study, there was an exhibit with the data that showed that I think there were 13 biological systems that were being affected in these animals with over 900 different biological effects. And that's what's happening to us too. Everything, system-wide, we are being impaired. Our biology is being degraded. And the reality is that there are other ways to do technology that are much safer, like fiber to the premises, cable hardwiring technology at every opportunity to minimize these destructive exposures.
And so something that I heard in your response, but I think I would like to hear called out more specifically, is the things we're seeing today, the symptoms and diseases we're seeing today, they're results of chronic exposures to levels that were common 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that, as Scott pointed out, the infrastructure today is more pervasive and more powerful. And so the incidence of disease that we're pointing to is the risk of those is going to be higher today for today's exposures than for the ones that actually led to these diseases.
Absolutely. We have not only more kinds of exposures, more exposures to indoors and out. And then we've also got the issue of they're going up into much higher and higher frequencies that are more biologically disruptive. And maybe Scott can tell us exactly what is the risk of 5G compared to the earlier studies on 3G and 4G. Why is it going to be more? What are the frequencies it's going into, and how different is it in other ways?
Yeah. So Scott, when we last spoke about 2 minutes ago, you brought up a bunch of what I thought were very compelling legal arguments based on individual rights, the rights of localities, the jurisdiction of the FCC, and so forth. Have you had the opportunity to test those in a legal setting yet?
No one has brought a case like we intend to bring.
So how do we get from here to there?
Well, and I'm sure Camilla's going to get into this in a minute, we need to find some folks who are willing to be plaintiffs and write up their stories in a legal complaint and file a case. We've pretty much decided we're going to be looking at one of the states in the Fourth Circuit, which is Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and that's where we're going to be filing. Cases all turn on facts. And so depending on who we can find that's willing to go forward, generally speaking, what we're looking for is somebody who's got a cell tower next to them that's made them sick or their children. Somebody who may be a landowner that runs livestock or does agriculture, because there's clear effects on, the birds, bees, trees, and
cows,
everyone else too. So that's a kind of a property claim. Then we will file it, and inevitably what's going to happen is the other side's going to file a motion to dismiss, and we'll respond, and then the judge there will decide whether we get to move forward with our claims.
Okay.
But generally
And
speaking,
oh
what
yeah.
we're going to be trying to raise is basic constitutional violation, individual rights and separation of powers as between the federal government and the state and local government. Fifth Amendment, Seventh Amendment, Ninth and Tenth Amendments, separation of powers, because, Congress has told the FCC that it gets to adjudicate people's individual rights, which we believe is not constitutionally permissible. They're not a court. And then with regard to the fight between the federal government and local jurisdictions, it's ultimately going to turn on what we call the Commerce Clause, whether the Commerce Clause to the Constitution allows the federal government to basically disable states and local jurisdictions from their traditional, long-standing authority to represent and protect their citizens' health, safety, and welfare.
So the part of the argument that both of you have laid out that I found most shocking and personally offensive, and when I say shocking, I mean from an American perspective, which is you're not even allowed to sue for damages in terms of loss of property value under 704. Because, and I'm sorry, and for the listeners, just a bit of context, it is well known that the presence of a visible cell tower near your property has a specific negative impact on the value of your property. And Scott, please, I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, 704 itself does not specifically speak to this disabling, this taking away of people's longstanding rights under what we call the common law or under state law to sue for damages when you have been personally injured or your property rights have been affected. The statute doesn't say that, but several courts, the Ninth Circuit, the Third Circuit, and then some state courts have held that even though it doesn't expressly say that, it impliedly does. And therefore, they have ruled that these traditional remedies that people have had forever to whenever you're injured or you have your property taken by someone to sue, that they are preempted. So this case has actually got two parts. One is we're going to restore individual rights. We're going to say, wait a minute, you can't take away people's rights. You just can't do it. They have a right to not be injured. And the federal government doesn't have a license to kill, nor can it issue them. It can't authorize private parties to come and steal your property. The second piece is a direct challenge to 704, which says, nor can Congress disable local jurisdictions' longstanding ability to act to protect their citizens' health, safety, and welfare.
Yeah. And so earlier when I said this all sounds very un-American, those are the principles that I was referring to, right? The protection and defense of property, individual rights, and obviously states' rights.
Yes.
Yeah. And so as I understand it, right, we've talked about how 704 prevents opposition to this infrastructure on certain grounds. But as I also understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there have been some successful battles against new cell towers in the intervening 29 years. How have those been justified? How did they succeed in those battles when a law like this exists?
Well, as it turns out, Children's Health Defense, who I'm their outside counsel for, has a separate initiative called stop5g.org. And what we do is when there is a tower proposed in a local area, the people who have concerns about it, whether it be property values or aesthetics, any of the traditional things that people are worried about, or quite frankly, even if they're afraid of getting made sick or sicker, They can come to us, and we have a team of people who help them fight towers at the local level using the grounds that still remain. Because Congress did limit local jurisdictions' ability to regulate on the basis of environmental effects, but it did not completely prevent them from looking at traditional zoning issues. Like, does this fit within the character of the community? Would it negatively impact property values? Is it ugly? Can we make it not so ugly? Is this the best place for a tower? Now, they can't completely deny a carrier's ability to put towers somewhere, but they still retain some control over where they go. And so what our team does is we help the people who are worried about something that's going to be right next door to them fight on the grounds that they can still fight on. And we've had some, success. Obviously, these are very powerful interests. They write political checks at the local level, too. But, we've got a pretty good record. There is a model for doing this, and I can't go in and say we're going to win, but our record's pretty good. We're about 50-50.
Excellent. So, Camilla, Scott brought up Children's Health Defense, and obviously we all know who the Secretary of Health and Human Services is, and many of us are aware of his MAHA commission. What would you recommend that commission focus on relating to these issues, given what you know about both the health and environmental risks?
Well, I think that we need to shine a light on what's really happening, do some truth telling, understand. I mean, if we don't really acknowledge what is happening, we put it under the rug and we're just ignoring all this so-called collateral damage where people are getting very, very sick. If we ignore that, we'll never find a solution. We need to bring it into the light. We need to acknowledge that there have been health effects, brain effects, effects on the integrity of our genome, effects on our ability to procreate. These are really important things. And this nonstop proliferation, it just keeps going. There's got to be another way to do communications. And so we need to acknowledge it as a major driver of chronic illness. I don't know what the right timing is, because the MAHA movement is, I think, going after some low-hanging fruit initially with, food additives and fluoride. And this is a more complex issue because it involves military interests as well. And the whole surveillance economy that has emerged, and that Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard has written a lot about. We need to, I think, backtrack and look at the whole economic model, not just regarding this issue, but so many other issues that we're facing today are related to an economic model that is putting profits and dominance and other motives above supporting life on this planet, supporting humans, supporting the environment. We depend on it, but we kind of forget that we're dependent on this bigger living system. So we just need more truth telling. We're doing it with 704 No More. There'll be some legislative efforts as well. And right now, Children's Health Defense can't have anything to do with Kennedy in his new position. But we know he's aware of the issue. They've covered the issue for many years now at Children's Health Defense, and we just need to keep getting the word out and it's a legal issue now. It really has become a fully illegal issue. I mean, we can always use more awareness raising, and 704 No More, we've rounded up over 100 health and environmental groups across the country in many, many states that are concerned about the health effects and environmental effects. And so this effort is a legal issue, involves legislative aspects, and a big grassroots push from the bottom up. So we really appreciate your covering this topic. We want to get more people involved, and people can go to 704nomore.org to learn more. And we need people to fuel the movement in any ways that they can, whether it's financially or volunteering, using whatever skill sets they have that could help. We need to grow the activism and put pressure from the bottom up as well as from the top down.
So this next question, I'm not sure which one of you or both of you want to answer, but Camilla, you've alluded a couple of times now to focusing on safer alternatives. And I think that's important to underscore. The goal here isn't to eliminate the internet infrastructure and decimate the economic underpinnings of the modern American society. Paint me a picture, one of you or both of you, paint me a picture. 704 no more succeeds. What does the connectivity infrastructure look like in 10 and 15 years?
Well, as we published at National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, we published a paper in 2018 written by Tim Sheckley called Reinventing Wires, The Future of Landlines and Networks, where we explained that on many grounds, and many technological grounds, as well as health grounds, wireless is an inferior delivery system of access, to the internet. We've been deceived. New generations come out, oh, it's faster, it's better, making it sound like all of this wireless is better. But in fact, nothing's going to be as good as a hardwired to the premises. So I think we need to hardwire at every opportunity. The core of the internet in the United States is fiber. And then it goes fiber to these cell towers that blast the neighborhood with radiation, and now being put up on the utility poles outside homes. And we need to see that fiber going all the way to the premises as often as possible. And there'll still be a cell phone industry, but we just need to start being responsible about it and incentivizing the industry to do things more responsibly and with a health consciousness.
Yeah, and just to underscore for listeners who may not have connected these ideas, if you offload more of the data transfer to hardwired connections, you can still have the wireless network in place and have it be much less powerful, because
Exactly.
the emissions of the infrastructure directly correlate to the amount of data that is being transferred over that infrastructure. So you could have a world in which we still have wireless infrastructure, but it is emitting a lot less because more of the burden is being carried by fiber. Is that?
Yeah, I think Environmental Working Group published a report a couple years ago saying that exposures to children could be hundreds of times less powerful, and still work. And I've heard that also from some of the international scientists. We don't need as much of this energy in our environment.
Yeah.
Certainly, if we go to fiber and also cable to the premises is fine too. That's what I use.
Yeah,
Scott,
you
what do you
might
think?
say this is overpowered.
Yeah, like
It
your
is
book with
overpowered.
your
Yeah,
father,
yeah.
Overpowered. And
Yeah,
now
and if
you
I
have
Sorry,
a
could,
Scott.
new one coming out, I heard,
yeah,
called Empowered, and I
Y-
can't wait
yeah.
till that's
If I could
published.
follow up on a couple of things. First of all,
Yes, please.
look, we're not trying to take people's cell phones away from them. Okay, we're just not. There's still going to be cell phones. The the problem is that the industry has forced us into a model where we rely on cell phones for things that they're not required for, like you just pointed out. We could see to it that a whole bunch more of the information that goes over wireless networks instead goes over a wired network. Where wireless comes in and where it still has utility is for what we call mobility. The industry wants everybody to use their cell phone in their home for internet.
Yeah.
And you just don't need to do that. Now, if you're in your car and you're trying to drive somewhere and you need a Google map, of course. But that still does not require the kind of data throughput that we're being told we have to have through the mobile network. The Europeans, their standards are far less than ours by orders of magnitude. Orders of magnitude. And yet their networks work just fine. Now, part of it is because they got good fiber networks too. But, we just don't have to be forced into use of a technology that, to be frank, is inferior and not really suited to the kinds of uses that we're being shoehorned into. Second, there was some mention of the Maha Commission, an action item for folks who are interested. The Maha Commission final report has been delivered to the White House. I haven't seen it, but there's a chance there's some EMR discussion in there. And what I would ask people to do who are interested in this is to write the White House and tell it to make sure that the final report addresses the EMR health and environmental issue. That was part of the original thing that came out of the executive order that created that commission. And so they need to have that topic discussed in the final report. Now, I suspect that there's going to be a lot of political pressure by the industry to pull out anything that they don't like on wireless in this final report. But the White House has it right now. And so anybody who wants to write on this and have some effective action should write the White House and say, hey, make sure the Maha report speaks to the EMR issue. Very timely thing.
Because it didn't in the first report that came out in June. It was really mentioned way in the back of the report. It wasn't one of the 4 core drivers of chronic illness in children that they focused on.
And before we wrap, I think you brought up something that you touched on earlier in the conversation. I think it's important to underscore, which is the link between these types of exposures and chronic disease, because that's obviously of great concern. I mean, obviously brain tumors and other types of cancerous diseases are of concern to people, but the rates of chronic disease in the United States have been exploding. And you referenced your recent paper in which this was predicted. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This is our report, The Safety of Wireless Technologies, the Scientific View. And basically, the rollout of the infrastructure started in earnest in about 1990 and has continued ever since. And the incidence of chronic illnesses just started exploding after 1990, and also whole new categories of illnesses that really were very rare before now have become very prevalent, like autoimmune conditions, neurological conditions have surpassed cancer, and cardiovascular issues in terms of the rate of death from neurological conditions is exploding. And so it's it's very, very clear that since 1990 to 2015, I think there were over 500 million new incidences of these fast-growing illnesses that were predicted by the Navy report back in 1971. Half a billion, over 500 million. So, we've got to look at the truth, look at the reality of what happened starting in 1990. And certainly there are other factors that also impact, the glyphosate, the food additives, the, sugar consumption. There are other major categories that have been creating imbalance in our bodies. But there's no doubt from what we know in the science to date that this is both EMFs are both a causative, cause these illnesses, and also can accelerate the illnesses that might have been initiated otherwise. So, and it fundamentally boils down to the presence of peroxynitrite, which is common to all chronic diseases. And so we need to, just get serious. We need to be truthful. Where this country it's so obvious, it's so corrupt in many ways. And, we need to, all the truth, all this ugliness is coming to the surface across every industry right now. And it's very exciting to me that the truth is starting to percolate to the surface and to be acted upon. And it is our responsibility to take action. So that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Scott is doing.
And Scott, as we wind down this conversation, just a quick follow on to what Camilla just said, trying to explain the corruption of the FCC in particular, which is the governing body here. It can seem a little conspiracy theory-ish to an average consumer, but this is very well documented, right? How the FCC has been captured by corporate interests, and it's been documented by very mainstream institutions. Can you help explain that?
Well, yes, the first modern day book on what we call regulatory capture was written by an economist, and guess what agency he used as the case study?
I'm going to guess the FC.
He did. It was the FCC. Of course, the industry then was the broadcast industry, the big TV stations. Okay. But even in the 70s, early 70s, and he was using data from the 50s and 60s, it was clear that this agency isn't there to protect the public's interest. It views its job as advancing the interest of the industry that it regulates. They are the epitome of a captured agency. Let me give you two really quick examples ripped from current headlines. Current chairman of the FCC, former Verizon lawyer. Okay. Current chief science technology officer at the FCC, just named last week, former technology officer from Verizon. So this agency is not going to protect the people's interest. It's not. It never will.
Yeah, and when this administration is over, I don't imagine these administrators will sell off into the sunset. I imagine many of them will go back to the companies that they came from.
No, they'll just go complete the circle on the revolving door. But let me tell you something. It's not just this administration. Okay.
No, I meant the ones. Yeah, I wasn't talking about just this administration, but I was saying that the specific administrators that you were talking about, right, will go back. So it's not just that they might favor the industry because they came from it. They also want to secure better jobs for when they leave.
That's one of the motivations behind the economic theory of regulatory capture. There are others.
Yeah.
I mean, I give a class on regulatory capture. Okay. And it's an hour and a half. So we can't talk about all the driving reasons. But let's just, please, everybody needs. I've been practicing in front of that agency for 47 years. Okay. They're captured. Always were. Doesn't matter whether they're D or R, who's running the agency, who's got the presidency. This is a bipartisan deal. It's just baked in. And so anybody who thinks that this federal agency is going to help them and their own little problem, and it's not a little problem here, it's a big problem. But to you, they're little because they're not worried about you. They're worried about the people who they see every day walking in the halls, their little minders who come and visit and do all that stuff and write campaign checks and do all of that stuff. That's who they're serving. And we just have to accept that.
So, Camilla, the website that you mentioned is 7nomore.org. I believe you mentioned that, and that link, everyone, will be in the show notes. It's 704, the number 704nomore.org. And you mentioned you're seeking volunteers, you're seeking donations. What else can people find on 704nomore.org?
Well, there's a resource section with some of the science. You can see the groups, the 100 plus groups that are part of the coalition. There are is a section called resources that has media interviews and articles. There are also some postcards, some PDFs of 2 postcards that people can get printed locally and share, put on bulletin boards and so forth, spread in their communities. And then there is an article, I'm trying to remember if it's on there. I think it is. If not, it's on Children's Health Defense. It's describing the plaintiff search in the Fourth Circuit down in the Carolinas and Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia. And so if people know of people there, or doctors there, people have been sick related to this, we would like to hear from them. And there's a form that they can fill out. And I just want to mention one other thing, if I could, that is on my mind that I'm just so concerned about and nobody's focused on is that, Americans take a lot of pharmaceutical drugs, right? Almost 5 billion prescriptions were written in 2024. But the research that's done on those drugs isn't done in a wireless versus, non-wireless environment. And the truth is that there are these EMFs can accelerate or suppress the actions that the drugs are meant to be addressing. So nobody's looking at this issue, and it is pretty scary.
Yeah, that
Given the
is
side effects for drug.
yeah, and it's also one reason why in general it can be very challenging and at a minimum incredibly expensive to try to run epidemiological studies into the health effects of these exposures, because there are no unexposed populations. And to the extent that they are unexposed, they're living in the middle of the Sahara and have many other differences that would distinguish them from the exposed populations.
And no doctor who's prescribing these drugs is asking their patients, well, how much wireless are you around?
Right.
Then it's just not a factor.
And they wouldn't know how to answer anyway, because it's really hard to measure.
And then the other thing is that people need to really focus on is, there's a problem with antibiotic resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some research that shows that antibiotic resistance to E. coli and Listeria, I think it is, and also DNA changes in E. coli, I think it was, from wireless exposure. So that's a big issue for our world today, and nobody's really looking at that. And also the explosion in growth in diabetes. Look at that. I mean, look at what's happening, and we've got, remember there was one study by Saudi Arabian researchers that looked at two different schools. They had a cell tower. Both of the schools had a cell tower 200 meters away from the school. And one tower was much higher than exposure than the other. And it showed an increased risk for diabetes measured by the hemoglobin A1C. And, this is I think the number one most costly disease, if I'm not mistaken, in America. And, the number of people and children that have it is exploding. And nobody's looking at these background issues that are so important. So
Well,
I appreciate your work so much, what you're doing, trying to educate people and help people shield their environments and their bodies.
No, and I appreciate both of you and your work with 704 No More, and also taking the time to come here and educate me and help educate my listeners on, because I think a lot of people aren't even aware of the 1996 Telecom Act continuing impact on all of our health, and just how ridiculous the law seems, not only at the time, but in retrospect, and how, like I said earlier, and I don't use this term lightly, but how fundamentally un-American these frameworks are. So once again, everybody, the website is 704nomore.org, and that link is in the show notes. And Camilla and Scott, thank you both very much for coming out today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And good luck with your new book.
Thank you.
Empowered.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Healthier Tech Podcast. Remember to check the show notes for all the links and resources we mentioned today. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or on the platform of your choice. And if you're ready to take control of your tech environment, head over to shieldyourbody.com to explore science-backed tools that help you live a safer, healthier life in today's connected world.